Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to our press conference at the Maine State House in beautiful Augusta, Maine, on this almost last day of winter, close to the last day of winter of 2016. My name is Hal Shurtleff. I am the coordinator for the John Birch Society. I cover 5 states of New England, upstate New York, and I get up on a regular basis. And before I introduce our person who came here to hear, just want to mention on our table over there we have a reprint from the New American Magazine on the subject of Common Core. It's about a year and a half old. Please make avail of that. Also, Duke Pesta is the academic director of Freedom Project Education. We have some information about that. It's a sort of an arm of the John Birch Society. And to learn more about our organization, please get yourself a little packet here called Discover the John Birch Society. Now, Dr. Duke Pesta, is a Shakespearean scholar. He is a professor at the University of Wisconsin in Oshkosh, and the academic director of Freedom Project Education. And probably the last couple of years, 3 years or so, he has conducted over 400 presentations on the subject of Common Core. He really didn't intend to become an expert, and perhaps the nation's expert and leading critic of Common Core. He's here for the homeschool conference in Rockland, Maine for the next couple of days, and tomorrow night he'll be speaking in Waldoboro, Maine, giving a full-blown presentation. And I kind of kid him. I say to people that he's a brilliant scholar, but he still believes that Shakespeare wrote Shakespeare. But we'll overlook that little flaw. Let's give him a nice warm hand, and thank you, Dr. Pesta.
Well, it's good to be here today. This is my first trip to the state of Maine. It's a beautiful state. I understand why people love it so much. And Hal is exactly right. I've given about 450 talks in 43 states in the last 3 years on Common Core. I've testified before about 20 state legislatures on the issue. And it's a serious problem for moms and dads, particularly if you have your kids in the public schools. We now know, with the passage of the ESSA Act by the Republican Congress, that the illegal means that were used to put Common Core in place 6 years ago, the federal government overreaching its bounds to take away state and local control of education, the success has now been enshrined. The only real safe place for America's children is distance from this public school system. It's unfortunate to say that now. But Common Core represents many things. First and foremost, we need to recognize about Common Core the way in which it systematically erodes the rights of families to impact what goes on in their kids' classrooms. I think this is the biggest problem. Back in the 1940s and 50s, America had the best education system in the world. We were the envy of the world. Most American kids for 100 years in this country learned in one-room schoolhouses. And the important thing about that was, how did America become a superpower? On the backs of men and women who learned in one-room schoolhouses. You had single-room classrooms where 3rd graders, 5th graders, 9th graders were all learning together. And why it worked is because you had, the standard was the teacher. The teacher who had those kids sitting in front of her, she knew what those kids needed. She knew what the 9th grader needed and the 3rd grader needed, and she could address those concerns directly. There was no bureaucracy, there was no overriding regulation. Good teachers working with kids, disciplined kids. The lesson we take from the history of American education prior to the 1960s, when it worked, was that you need 3 things to educate a child. You need a committed parent. That means your parents have to be involved in the kid's education. One of the reasons we're in this mess with our government schools, our public schools, is because parents have decided for a long time now that by turning their kids over to the public schools 8 hours a day, 10 hours a day, they're really getting babysitting. This is free daycare, they think. And they've divorced themselves from the goings-on of the schools. And so we need committed parents, we need disciplined children. That's the second thing. Do we have parents who are willing to turn off their kids' iPads? Do we have parents who are willing to pull their kids out of soccer practice or ballet or piano lessons if they're not doing their homework? And the third thing you need to make education work are good teachers. If you have those 3 things, you have education. That's why our one-room schoolhouse model for 100 years worked. Because you had those 3 things. Parents were always on the side of the teachers, working with teachers to help their kids get a better education. Education was stressed in the home, where parents had control when the kids weren't in the schools. That's all gone now. In the 1960s and the 70s, particularly with the creation of the Department of Education, the federal level in the 1970s. We had the control of schools bumped up from the classroom to the districts, then in the 80s from the districts to the states, then in the early 2000s from the states to the federal government. And now we see with things like Common Core a unifying moment where the federal government consolidates its control not only over who gets to teach, what they get to teach, but the curriculum as well. These huge, broad tests now, these standardized tests that measure the sole measure of our kids' performance. You're going to give the same test to 60 million American school kids. That test cannot tell a working teacher a single thing about the kids sitting in front of her. We also know that the teachers don't get to see the tests. The very teachers whose careers are evaluated on how well these kids do on the exams, they don't even get to see the questions. They don't get to see what the kids got right and wrong. There is no possible connection or benefit from them. And so we have a situation with things like Common Core now where not only are moms and dads divorced from their kids' education, we've got the local school boards that have become meaningless now. Even now, the state education boards, the state-driven boards of education, are now simply thrall to what's going on at the federal level. The consolidation is afoot here. How do when we think about American public schools, the idea that public schools belong to families, the idea that public means they belong to you. The primary stakeholders of our kids' public school education should be the children and the parents. They are the people who are most cut out of this process. States like Maine, one of those states where you should never have had this to begin with. There's a tremendous streak of independence in the state. There's a tremendous a commitment to family and local communities, particularly in New England states, that should never have messed with this to begin with. Your neighbors to the south, Massachusetts, had the best standards in the entire country before they gave them away for $450 million under Democrat Governor Deval Patrick. Gave away the best. Massachusetts was the only state in the union. If you pulled it out of the United States and put it up against the high-achieving countries of the world, Massachusetts kids would have finished at the top in reading and writing and mathematics. For $450 million, bought a bribe from Race to the Top, Massachusetts abandoned its standards, took the Common Core, and every New England state followed suit. Here you are in Maine now, and the control of Maine's kids in Maine public schools is not your responsibility anymore. The primary argument that I make when I tour the country talking about Common Core is as follows. The single most important thing that FedEd does, and we've had the encroachment of federal education well before Common Core. I would argue, you go back to the creation of the Department of Education in 1979. We didn't need it. Our schools up and through 1960 were the best in the world. The creation of the Department of Education in 1979 had no other function but to preserve its own bureaucracy. I don't know if you recognize that the so bloated 5,000 employees at the Federal Department of Education, they have their own SWAT team, which you pay for as taxpayers, that they've never used in 50 years. The amount of waste. Whenever the federal government creates a meaningless bureaucracy like the Department of Education, the whole purpose of it is to propagate its own survival, not to help the kids learn. And that's what we see with the Department of Ed. The first thing the Department of Education did 50 years ago, 45 years ago, was to begin the process of centralizing everything to them. All the money that your state schools get from the federal government flows through the Department of Education. Now, the accreditation for teachers is regulated there. The curriculum now through Common Core is overseen. These meaningless tests now are orchestrated at the federal level. People don't realize, back in 2008 and 2009, when the outgoing Republican President Bush and the incoming Democrat President Obama demanded all that stimulus money, remember those billions and billions of dollars we as taxpayers had to turn over to the federal government to bail out banks and car companies, we were told. Little did anybody know that hundreds of millions of dollars initially and billions in the final analysis of the stimulus went directly to the Department of Education. The Department of Education took, in 2009 alone, $350 million of the stimulus package without you even knowing it, and used it to create the Common Core tests. Think about it. Before the Common Core standards were even written, the federal government, the Federal Department of Education, was already writing the tests for curriculum that wasn't written. So you had the tests before you had the curriculum, which means that whatever happened next was going to follow the tests. This is how the feds now control your classroom. The only meaningful way we have to measure Common Core are these exams. Whoever controls the exams controls what goes on in your kids' classrooms. Teachers are quitting by the tens of thousands. Teachers close enough to retiring are walking away. And this is the really frustrating thing. The new teachers who are being trained in your Department of Educations at the big college campuses are only being taught how to do Common Core curriculum. In about 5 years, the schools are going to be stocked with teachers who cannot teach any other way. They will no longer be able to teach kids genuine math. They will no longer understand a balanced view of American history. We are already at the point now where this has been locked down in your public schools. Maine can take a big step if we can convince the powers that be, convince your governor to distance himself from Common Core. And this is the thing that's so frustrating. 46 states in the Union took Common Core by basically being bribed. The federal Race to the Top program in 2009, 10, 11, 12 encouraged the states to apply for money. 46 of them did. They received this cash, Maine too, and the only real requirement of accepting this money from the federal government was that you had to take the Common Core state standards, in most instances before they were even written. So most of the states that took it without knowing what it is. But keep this in mind. The money you took for Common Core amounts to about 5% of your state budget for education for 1 year. New York is the classic example. New York was the first state in the Union to take Race to the Top money, $700 million in 2009. For $700 million, New York schools were sold to Common Core. 2009, the standards hadn't been written yet. So by taking $700 million, they had to sign up for Common Core in 2 years when it was rolled out. And the interesting fact, $700 million is about 6% of New York state education budget for 1 year. For 1 year, 6%, control of education left New York, went to the feds. The same thing happened here in Maine. The only way we can fix this problem is to divorce ourselves from the overweening mandates of the federal government. It makes common sense, Maine. These kids are your kids. How do you impact what goes on in Washington? You can impact what goes on in Maine. You have no vote over who the next Secretary of Education in Washington, D.C. is. You have no say in the matter. The next president will appoint him. You have no control. But you do have control over the governor of Maine. You do have control over your local school boards. You can take back control of your public schools and allow parents and local people to dictate what your kids are getting in the classroom. If you don't do that, one more blow to state sovereignty, one more blow to independence, one more blow, moms and dads, to your ability to provide your kids a good, solid education. Right now, I honestly believe this. The only safe space for your kids is outside of the public schools. There's no fixing them in the short term. Even if the collective will of the country rallied around a transformation in education, it would take 10, 20 years to yank all this out. Take care of your children, find alternate means to educate them. And as you do so, homeschool them, find really good private schools or Christian schools. Many of those have accepted Common Core. Do your homework wisely. Take care of your family first, take care of your kids and grandkids, but continue to fight at the state level to cede some of this power back. Or before you know it, you're going to have one education system, one model, all run by progressives, all anti-American, all anti-education. I'll close by making this observation. The federal government very rarely names things what they are. When the federal government takes things that don't belong to them, they give them rosy, cheery names. Did anybody actually believe the Affordable Care Act is affordable? The people who wrote it knew it wasn't affordable, but by naming the Obamacare legislation the Affordable Care Act, they knew. 50-60% of Americans would assume because you call it affordable, it is. They made one mistake. They actually named Common Core what it was. Common. Raise your hand if you have common kids. Raise your hand if your kids are standard. You're not. We don't see our kids as common. Our kids aren't the same kid. When you have one education, a Common Core, you're going to get 60 million American school kids to exactly the same place. By definition, it has to be a low place. It has to be a common place. The federal government is playing social justice with your kids' education. They have decided that it's not fair that some kids can get ahead in certain subjects and others can't. So they're going to lower the bar. They're going to make everybody the same. We call this socialism. This is what the fascist Nazis did. This is what the communist socialists did. They took kids and they engineered their education to get outcomes rather than allowing kids to become what they are. And we see how that worked out. It's shameful that European nations, even Russia itself, has rejected many of these means, even as your federal government imposes them on the states illegally. I ask you, Maine, to join states like South Carolina, Indiana, others across the country that have at least taken the first step towards distancing themselves from federal control of state education. Unless you do that, your kids will be out of your reach forever. Thank you very much.